The calendar showed November 1941, when Lieutenant Colonel Benjamin Kelsey found himself alone in his office at Wright Field in Dayton, Ohio, well into the evening after the sun had dipped below the horizon. He sat in the gathering darkness, steeling himself for a telephone conversation that carried the weight of his entire military future. One wrong move, one discovery by the wrong people, and his career would evaporate like morning dew. What he was about to do ran directly against everything his commanding officers had ordered. The mandate was crystal clear across the entire service. Fighter aircraft would not receive external fuel tanks. The order was absolute, no exceptions, no discussion. The officers known as bomber advocates held the real power in military aviation doctrine, and they had made their position unmistakably clear. Yet something in Kelsey's mind pushed him toward the telephone anyway. He could see what they refused to acknowledge, what kept him awake at night. Without drop tanks, American fighter aircraft would never be able to follow bombers deep into enemy territory. The bombers would venture far beyond protective reach, and pilots would pay the ultimate price for that vulnerability. Without those external tanks, America faced a grim future in the coming conflict. He picked up the receiver and dialed Lockheed Corporation. This would leave no official trace, no memoranda, no signed orders, no documentation. Just a quiet understanding between men who grasped what lay ahead on the horizon. The plan was straightforward. 100 P-38 Lightning fighters would undergo secret modification. Fuel lines would be rerouted, attachment points reinforced, external tank capabilities engineered into machines that officially had no such capacity. If command discovered this unauthorized work, Kelsey would stand alone and accept full blame. His military career would become ash and memory. But if war arrived, and every piece of intelligence suggested it would come soon, those forbidden tanks might decide whether America emerged victorious or faced catastrophic failure. He had no way of knowing then that his act of quiet rebellion would create the conditions for one of history's most audacious military operations. 16 months into the future, on April 18, 1943, 18 P-38 Lightning fighters would thunder down a coral runway on Guadalcanal, groaning under an extraordinary fuel load. These aircraft would travel farther than any fighters had ever ventured in actual combat. They would navigate across more than 400 miles of open ocean, skimming just above the waves, guided only by compass readings, airspeed calculations, and the ticking of a wristwatch. When they reached their target, they would arrive within a single minute of their calculated intercept time. That precision would make possible an execution. They would shoot down Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, the genius strategist behind Pearl Harbor, the commanding presence who shaped the Imperial Japanese Navy's war. All of this became possible because Kelsey had refused to follow official policy, because he gave fighters the fuel capacity to accomplish what seemed impossible. The journey toward that April morning began not with aerial combat or explosions, but in the quiet corridors of bureaucratic struggle within the United States Army Air Corps. It was fundamentally a story of engineers who perceived the future with clarity, while their superior officers clung to strategies that belonged to an earlier era. It was also a story of intelligence specialists who would eventually hand commanders an opportunity so extraordinarily valuable that some argued the risk of using it would be too great. Yet most importantly, it was the story of 18 pilots who flew a mission across distances that military planners had declared mathematically impossible, accomplishing their goal through technological innovation, navigation that bordered on supernatural precision, and raw courage that approached the boundaries of madness. The mathematical reality of fighter aviation in 1941 was brutally straightforward. Aircraft without external fuel tanks could only reach a few hundred miles from their base. Heavy bomber formations, traveling deep into hostile territory to strike their targets, routinely operated far outside that protective distance. The answer appeared obvious to anyone who understood aviation. Attach external tanks to the fighters, stretch their operational range, keep the bombers defended for every moment of their journey. Yet the men making decisions about American air strategy flatly rejected this solution with an intensity that resembled religious conviction. They identified themselves with a doctrine that critics mockingly called the bomber mafia, though the name was never used in official channels. These officers carried absolute confidence in one belief: Strategic bombing would determine the outcome of future wars. Massive bombers flying in tight defensive formations, each bristling with protective machine guns, would be able to fend off enemy fighters without assistance. No escort fighter could penetrate that wall of defensive firepower. Extended-range fighter escorts would serve no purpose, or worse, they would waste resources better directed toward bomber production. More bombers meant more tonnage delivered to targets, and more tonnage meant victory. The theory was mathematically elegant and absolutely catastrophically wrong. But when believers in a doctrine gain positions of genuine power, doctrine becomes policy. By 1941, the bomber mafia controlled the machinery of aircraft development throughout the Army Air Corps. Their reach extended into explicit rules and prohibitions. Official policy explicitly stated that drop tanks should not be researched or developed. Fighters would remain unmodified to carry external fuel. Anyone pursuing that research direction would find their efforts stopped and their career jeopardized. The rule was ironclad and backed by officers positioned to destroy anyone foolish enough to resist their vision. Benjamin Scoville Kelsey entered the world on March 9, 1906, born in Waterbury, Connecticut, in a time when powered flight was still a novelty. From his earliest years, aviation captured his imagination. He pursued his education at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, completing a Bachelor of Science in Mechanical Engineering in 1928, and later adding a Master of Science degree in Aeronautics in 1932. These formative years occurred during aviation's infancy, when engineering knowledge was being invented almost daily. He enlisted in the Army Air Corps on May 2, 1929, becoming a pilot and engineer both, someone who understood aircraft from the smallest fastener to the overall design philosophy. By 1934, he found himself assigned to Wright Field as Fighter Projects Officer, placing him at the absolute center of American military aircraft development. For more than a decade, he wielded significant influence determining which fighter designs would be pursued, tested, and ultimately deployed to combat squadrons. His direct supervisor was Colonel Oliver Patton Eccles, who led the Air Corps' Material Division throughout the entire war. Eccles proved to be a forward-thinking administrator who recognized that future wars would be won or lost by which side possessed superior industrial capacity and technological edge. He granted Kelsey considerable freedom to chase fighter projects that showed promise, even when those projects contradicted the prevailing orthodoxy about how air war should be fought. The partnership between these two men would become essential to what unfolded. When the bomber mafia's fury descended upon Kelsey's work, Eccles provided shelter and protection. When regulations needed quiet circumvention, Eccles conveniently found something else to occupy his attention. Many years after the war concluded, Kelsey would acknowledge Eccles as the person who truly won World War II, recognizing that his commander's backing had allowed the innovations that ultimately proved decisive in aerial combat. The Lockheed P-38 Lightning embodied Kelsey's career achievement, the fighter that would become inseparable from his name. When Lockheed responded to a 1937 military specification calling for a high-altitude interceptor, they created something entirely unconventional. The design featured twin booms extending backward from the fuselage, with the cockpit and weapons mounted in a central nacelle between them. Two Allison V-1710 engines provided propulsion and security. Should one engine fail, a pilot could coax the aircraft home using only the other. This redundancy would prove invaluable when flying the vast distances the Pacific Ocean demanded. The concentrated armament in the nose, one 20mm cannon paired with four 50-caliber machine guns, all pointed forward in the same direction. This configuration gave P-38 pilots extraordinary accuracy at extended range. The prototype, designated XP-38, first touched the sky on January 27, 1939, with Kelsey himself commanding from the pilot's seat, launching from March Field in California. 2 weeks afterward, on February 11th, Kelsey took the aircraft aloft again, this time attempting a coast-to-coast speed record to impress the skeptical senior officers back in Washington. He lifted off from March Air Force Base at 10:30 in the morning, climbing toward 20,000 feet and pushing the throttles as far forward as they would go. 7 hours and 48 minutes later, he was approaching Mitchell Field in New York, having shattered the existing record. Then everything went catastrophically wrong on approach. The carburetors began to malfunction, the engines sputtered and died. Kelsey had no choice but to force the aircraft down, executing an emergency landing on a golf course in New York, destroying the only prototype that existed. He emerged from the wreckage with minor injuries, but the aircraft was completely destroyed. Yet Kelsey refused to abandon his vision for the Lightning. The aircraft had demonstrated speed and reach capabilities that surpassed every other fighter then in American service. The twin-engine design offered safety margins that single-engine competitors could never provide. Lockheed received contracts to begin production. By the middle of 1941, P-38 Lightning fighters were coming off the assembly line at Burbank, California, in steadily increasing numbers. They were genuinely fast, tremendously powerful, and could climb to altitude with speed that no other fighter then flying could match. But they possessed a critical deficiency: range. The standard P-38 through the P-38H variant carried 306 gallons of fuel internally. Later versions, the P-38J and P-38L, would eventually boost this to 416 gallons, though those models did not yet exist in 1941. Operating at cruise settings, the early versions could stay airborne for approximately 900 miles total. Adequate for defensive missions, sufficient to intercept bombers approaching American coastlines, but nowhere near sufficient for offensive operations into hostile airspace. Bomber escort missions over Europe or across the Pacific Ocean required fighters capable of remaining aloft for 1,200 miles or more. The answer any competent engineer would reach was inevitable. Attach external fuel tanks beneath the wings, tanks that could be jettisoned when empty or when entering actual combat. This technology presented no mysteries. The Japanese had already equipped their Zero fighters with drop tanks during 1940, yet American doctrine explicitly forbade it. Kelsey understood the future rushing toward them all. German aggression was becoming increasingly likely to drag America into European conflict. Japanese expansion throughout Asia and Southeast Asia threatened American interests across the Pacific expanse. When war came, and Kelsey believed with certainty that it would come, the distances involved would tax American supply lines to their absolute limits. Fighters protecting bomber streams would need range far exceeding what internal fuel could provide. Kelsey recognized he had to act, and that action had to remain hidden from the bomber mafia and their allies. So in November 1941, 1 month before Pearl Harbor transformed American history, Kelsey reached out to contacts at Lockheed. His words were measured and precise. He requested that drop tank capability be added to 100 P-38E fighters, then moving through the production pipeline. These aircraft would receive fuel lines connecting their internal systems to hardpoints positioned beneath the wings. Engineers would construct attachment mechanisms capable of holding external tanks securely throughout flight while allowing instant release when a pilot activated a handle inside the cockpit. Lockheed's engineers grasped the implications immediately. They also recognized that official authorization would never materialize. This modification existed in a gray area between unauthorized and absolutely essential. They agreed to proceed based solely on mutual understanding. During the following weeks, Lockheed's workforce quietly installed the modifications. Fuel lines were installed and tested, hardpoints were strengthened through reinforced welding, electrical systems were altered so pilots could direct fuel flow from either internal or external sources. The changes were incorporated so skillfully that anyone casually observing a modified P-38 would notice nothing obviously different. Yet pilots would now possess the ability to carry external fuel tanks, expanding their operational range by hundreds of miles. Remaining was the challenge of actually manufacturing the tanks themselves. External fuel tank design revealed engineering complexities that weren't immediately obvious. The tanks required aerodynamic shape to minimize drag during flight. They needed structural integrity to withstand flight stresses while remaining light enough to avoid excessive burden on the airframe. Perfect sealing was essential, or fuel would vaporize at high altitude, where temperatures fell far below freezing. Fuel had to transfer reliably through pumps and valves to reach the engines. When jettisoned, the tanks had to separate cleanly without striking control surfaces or damaging engines. Lockheed engineers created teardrop-shaped aluminum tanks in two configurations. The smaller design held 165 gallons of fuel. The larger version held approximately 300 gallons, though engineering records document some variation in specifications based on configuration details and fuel density. Each tank stretched roughly 13 feet in length, with maximum diameter around 3 feet. These tanks attached to hardpoints positioned between the fuselage and engines, located sufficiently near the aircraft centerline that even carrying one large tank and one smaller tank would maintain reasonable flight balance. The design combined elegance with functionality, while simultaneously violating every principle of official Air Corps policy. By early December 1941, the first P-38 fighters equipped with drop tank capability were nearing completion of final testing at Lockheed's Burbank facility. Engineers confirmed that the systems functioned reliably. Kelsey had successfully defied the bomber mafia orthodoxy and handed American fighter pilots the tool they would desperately need in the battles ahead. Then, on December 7, 1941, Japanese carrier aircraft descended on Pearl Harbor. America crossed into wartime, and every assumption about fighter doctrine faced testing in the crucible of actual combat. The Pearl Harbor attack killed more than 2,403 Americans and wounded over 1,078 additional service members. The Pacific Fleet sustained losses that seemed almost incomprehensible. 18 ships were destroyed or severely damaged, including 8 battleships. 4 battleships went to the bottom. The Arizona exploded in a fireball and settled permanently into the harbor mud, carrying 177 sailors with her. The Oklahoma rolled completely over, trapping hundreds of men inside her capsized hull where they would perish. The Japanese strike force completed its mission and returned to its carriers, having sustained no capital ship losses. The attack represented tactical brilliance, and the architect of that brilliance was Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto. Yamamoto was born on April 4, 1884, in Nagaoka, Japan, in a prefecture on Honshu. He was the 6th son born to a schoolteacher, and his given name, Isoroku, literally meant 56, reflecting his father's age at his birth. The Imperial Japanese Naval Academy received his enrollment, and he graduated in 1904, just in time to witness his first combat. At the Battle of Tsushima on May 27, 1905, Yamamoto was stationed aboard the cruiser Nishin when she engaged the Russian fleet. An explosion from enemy artillery erupted near his battle station. Shrapnel tore through his young body, severing the index and middle fingers of his left hand and creating permanent scarring across his stomach. He had reached only 21 years of age, yet he had already learned that modern naval warfare was horrifyingly brutal, absolutely decisive, and utterly indifferent to individual survival. Yamamoto's career progressed steadily upward through the naval hierarchy during the following decades. He studied at Harvard University between 1919 and 1921, absorbing English language fluency and studying economics and the global petroleum industry. American factories impressed him during his travels across the continental United States, witnessing firsthand the industrial power that would eventually shape his strategic thinking. He served as naval attaché in Washington on 2 separate occasions, observing American naval construction and defense planning. By the late 1930s, Yamamoto commanded the Imperial Navy's First Fleet, and in 1939 he received appointment as Commander-in-Chief of the Combined Fleet, the highest naval position available in Japan. Yamamoto actively opposed war with America. He had seen American factories with his own eyes, understood American resources and determination. Japan's early advantages would eventually face the crushing weight of America's industrial capacity in any extended conflict. When officers asked whether he expected victory against America, he responded with brutal honesty. He could run wild for 6 months, maybe a year, but beyond that point he possessed no confidence whatsoever. Japan's leaders dismissed his warnings. They believed American democracy was fundamentally weak, fractured by internal division, incapable of sustained sacrifice. Yamamoto understood differently, but when his nation committed to war, he designed the attack that offered Japan the best possible starting position. The Pearl Harbor strike aimed to cripple American naval power in the Pacific, providing Japan time to seize the resource territories throughout Southeast Asia before America could organize an effective response. The operation achieved surprise and inflicted tremendous damage, yet it failed to destroy the Pacific Fleet's aircraft carriers, which happened to be away from port that day. More problematically, the attack unified American public opinion in ways Japanese planners had never anticipated. The sleeping giant Yamamoto, feared, had awakened, and it burned with fury. 6 months following Pearl Harbor, Yamamoto led the combined fleet toward Midway Atoll, hoping to draw American carriers into direct battle and eliminate them. The plan was ambitious, intricately detailed, and rested on the assumption that American codebreakers could not decrypt Japanese naval messages. That assumption proved catastrophically mistaken. American cryptanalysts had already broken into the Japanese JN-25 naval code. They intercepted Yamamoto's orders, understood his intentions, and positioned 3 American carriers as an ambush force. The Battle of Midway, spanning from June 4 through June 7, 1942, destroyed Japanese naval superiority in the Pacific. The main carrier action occurred on June 4, with the USS Yorktown sinking after suffering damage on June 7. 4 Japanese fleet carriers were sent to the bottom, taking hundreds of veteran pilots with them. The trained air groups that had fought together for years were shattered beyond recovery. Japan never recovered from those catastrophic losses. Yamamoto survived, but his strategic position lay in ruins. The 6-month period he promised to dominate had expired. Now began the grinding attritional warfare that Yamamoto had always dreaded. By early 1943, the Pacific War had fundamentally shifted against Japan. American forces had landed on Guadalcanal in the Solomon Islands back in August 1942, starting a vicious campaign lasting until February 1943. Japanese soldiers fought with suicidal courage, but American production was relentless. For every aircraft Japan manufactured, America built 5. For every ship Japan launched, America launched 10. The mathematics were implacable. Yamamoto recognized this reality. In April 1943, Yamamoto organized Operation YGO, an ambitious aerial offensive intended to slow American momentum through the Solomon Islands and New Guinea. Between April 1st and April 16th, the operation concentrated 350 Japanese aircraft for coordinated strikes against Allied positions. The objective was halting Allied progress following Japan's Guadalcanal defeat, while elevating Japanese military morale through visible offensive action. Success might purchase Japan a few additional months, but Yamamoto harbored no illusions. The war was essentially finished. Only questions about timing remained. Once Operation YGO concluded, Yamamoto decided to conduct a morale-building inspection of Japanese bases scattered through the Upper Solomon Islands. His staff compiled a comprehensive itinerary documenting every detail. On April 18th, Yamamoto would travel by air from Rabaul to Balali Airfield near Bougainville Island during the morning hours. The schedule was precise, extensively detailed, and encrypted using the Japanese JN-25D naval cipher for transmission to the receiving bases. The message wore the date April 13, 1943, and carried the designation NTF-1TFE-1755 in Japanese naval records. On April 14, 1943, American radio stations picked up the transmission. Multiple intercept locations simultaneously received the Japanese message. The information traveled directly to Fleet Radio Unit Pacific at Pearl Harbor, commonly known as Station Hypo, or to personnel using the acronym FRUPAC, Navy Cryptanalysis Teams, among them traffic specialist John Paul Stevens, who would go on to sit on the United States Supreme Court from 1975 until 2010, devoted themselves to cracking the encrypted message. Stevens himself wasn't engaged in code-breaking work. His role centered on examining the deciphered intercepts and producing intelligence assessments. The true cryptanalysis job fell to specialists like Ham Wright, Tommy Dyer, and Alva Laswell, who labored over the complex ciphers. In mere hours, they'd broken open Yamamoto's complete travel schedule. They knew exactly when he'd arrive at Balal, precisely when he'd depart, what aircraft he'd use, how many fighter escorts would accompany him, every detail the planners of an ambush would need. This breakthrough intelligence reached Admiral Chester Nimitz, who commanded the entire Pacific Fleet. Nimitz grasped immediately what this meant. Yamamoto stood as the mastermind behind Pearl Harbor. He possessed the strategic brilliance that had handed Japan its string of early triumphs. Among all the naval commanders Japan could claim, none matched his ability. Killing him would strike a catastrophic blow to Japanese confidence and military leadership. Yet acting on this intelligence carried enormous danger. Should Japan discover that America had cracked their codes, they'd abandon their cipher systems entirely. America would forfeit its most powerful intelligence weapon in the entire Pacific theater. Only the highest echelons could authorize this decision. Secretary of the Navy Frank Knox carried the intelligence to President Franklin Roosevelt. What happened next, according to accounts that have never received official confirmation, suggested Roosevelt made his choice with striking brevity. Get Yamamoto. Whether Roosevelt spoke precisely those words remains unclear and debated, but his intent proved unmistakable. Nimitz received clearance to organize and execute an operation designed to locate Admiral Yamamoto and eliminate him. The Naval Command would take precautions to safeguard the code-breaking advantage. The opportunity seemed too significant to let slip away. Nimitz passed responsibility to Admiral William Halsey, who oversaw American military operations across the South Pacific. Halsey delegated the planning to Rear Admiral Mark Mitchell, directing air forces throughout the Solomon Islands. Mitchell ran his command from Henderson Field on Guadalcanal, a former Japanese runway that the Americans had captured. Months of ferocious combat had revolved around this airstrip's control. From Henderson Field, Mitchell commanded squadrons from the Navy, Marine Corps, and Army Air Forces scattered throughout the Solomon Islands. Mitchell examined the intelligence and identified the obstacle immediately. Distance posed everything. The spot where they'd intercept Yamamoto lay west of Bougainville Island, roughly 435 miles in a straight line from Henderson Field. To prevent discovery by the network of Japanese coast watchers and radar stations scattered across the Solomon Islands, attacking planes would need to fly an indirect winding path south and westward. This roundabout approach would add another 150 miles or more to the outbound journey alone. The total distance to the target climbed to approximately 600 miles. Following the interception, the aircraft could race directly homeward, bringing the complete mission distance to something near 1,000 miles. No fighter currently based at Henderson Field possessed sufficient range for this mission. In fact, no fighter aircraft stationed anywhere in the Pacific could manage that distance, with precisely one exception. The Lockheed P-38 Lightning represented the singular possibility. The P-38G variant deployed across the South Pacific carried 306 gallons of internal fuel storage. Under standard flying conditions, this offered roughly 900 miles of total range. For the Yamamoto mission, that fell short. Nevertheless, Kelsey's unorthodox modifications had equipped the P-38 with a decisive benefit. The aircraft could accept external drop tanks. When a P-38 carried tanks holding 165 gallons under each wing, pilots could access an additional 330 gallons of fuel, substantially extending the plane's reach. Still, even that boost would prove marginal for a 1,000-mile operation that included 10 to 15 minutes of high-power combat. Mitchell's intelligence personnel worked through the fuel calculations with merciless accuracy. 600 miles to target while flying low, pushing through humid tropical atmosphere that devoured fuel consumption. A span of 10 to 15 minutes in the combat zone with engines screaming at maximum power. 400 miles back to base, gaining altitude where thinner air meant better efficiency. Each drop of fuel mattered enormously. The standard 165-gallon tanks wouldn't supply enough. They needed the heavier 300-gallon tanks, and therein resided a serious complication. The 3 P-38 squadrons stationed at Henderson Field had been requesting drop tanks for multiple weeks. Supply channels moved sluggishly through Army logistics, and the Southwest Pacific commanded no priority status. The squadrons had accumulated some 165-gallon tanks, though insufficient for 18 aircraft. The larger 300-gallon tanks hadn't arrived at Guadalcanal whatsoever. For this operation to proceed, those tanks had to be located and delivered right away. Mitchell employed every advantage of his rank and position. That evening, transport planes departed Port Moresby in New Guinea, carrying something invaluable: 20 large drop tanks, each containing 300 gallons of fuel. The aircraft crossed hundreds of miles of open ocean through darkness, finding their way by instruments to arrive at Henderson Field as dawn broke. Mechanics stood waiting on the tarmac. When the cargo planes touched down, the crews started the installation process without hesitation. One 300-gallon tank and one 165-gallon tank went under each P-38. This unbalanced arrangement put approximately 1,000 pounds of additional weight on one side of each plane, but the mounting points stayed near enough to the fuselage centerline that pilots could compensate. By sunrise, 18 P-38 Lightnings were prepared for what would become the longest fighter mission ever attempted during the Pacific War. Major John Mitchell, leading the 339th Fighter Squadron, received the assignment to command the operation. Mitchell was 32, a native of Enid, Mississippi, and already recognized as an ace with 5 confirmed kills to his credit. Those who knew him praised his exceptional navigation abilities and his extraordinary composure when things grew dangerous. This operation would demand both qualities to their fullest measure. Mitchell's briefing offered no sugarcoating. He would command 18 P-38s across a 600-mile journey over ocean, finding his way through dead reckoning alone. Once airborne, silence would rule the airwaves. Radio communication would stop completely, critical for preventing Japanese radar operators from receiving any warning. Mitchell would depend on his compass, mathematical calculations of speed, and elapsed time. After precisely 2 hours of flying at wave-top height, he would reach the interception point exactly 10 minutes ahead of Yamamoto's scheduled landing at Balale. Precision would be measured in mere seconds. Show up too early, and Japanese radar might spot them. Arrive too late, and Yamamoto would already be on the ground surrounded by hundreds of Japanese personnel and 75 Zero fighters stationed at Kahili Airfield on Bougainville. Mitchell asked for one adjustment to his own plane, a Navy compass unit. The Army-issue compasses, fitted into P-38s, handled regular navigation adequately, yet this operation demanded absolute precision. Marine Corps Lieutenant Colonel Luther Moore supplied a Navy compass, offering superior accuracy and steadiness. Ground personnel installed it in Mitchell's aircraft the evening before launch. Every small edge counted. The 18 fighters split into 2 separate elements. 4 planes formed the attack group, assigned to strike Yamamoto's bombers directly. Mitchell would pilot the remaining 14 as escort, shielding against the Zero fighters that would defend Yamamoto and maintaining height advantage in case additional Zeros launched from Kahili. The attack group commander was Captain Thomas Lanphier Jr., just 24 years old, from Detroit, who'd already notched several victories. His element lead would be First Lieutenant Rex Barber. 2 other pilots rounded out the attack unit: First Lieutenant Besby Holmes and First Lieutenant Raymond Hine. Intelligence reported that Yamamoto would occupy a Mitsubishi G4M transport, which American forces had christened the Betty. The Betty descended from a twin-engine bomber chassis, reconfigured to haul passengers. Speed and range were solid, but the aircraft suffered from notorious fragility against bullets. The Japanese builders had removed protective armor and fuel tank self-sealing systems to trim weight and expand range. American pilots nicknamed it the Flying Zippo because it erupted into flames so readily when struck. That vulnerability would determine the outcome. 6 Mitsubishi A6M0 fighters from the 204th Air Group Squadron would provide escort protection for Yamamoto. The Zero possessed impressive speed, exceptional maneuverability, and formidable dogfighting prowess in low-altitude engagements. However, Zeros flying from Bougainville typically lacked radio equipment to conserve weight. Coordinating their defensive response would challenge their pilots. On the evening of April 17th, Mitchell assembled all 18 pilots designated for the assignment. Maps covered the operations table inside the dugout command post. Heat, smoke, and close quarters made the space feel stifling. Admiral Halsey attended, along with senior Marine and Navy officers whose responsibility encompassed Solomon Islands airspace. Mitchell's finger traced the planned route across the map. 5 distinct legs, each computed down to specific measurements. They would depart Guadalcanal flying southwest for 85 miles, then northwest across 160 miles, then westward for 135 miles, then northeast for 75 miles, finishing with a northwest run straight to the interception area, combining for roughly 600 miles outbound. The flight would skim at merely 50 feet above the ocean surface to evade radar systems. Navigation would rely on occasional islands appearing in the distance. Mitchell's performance managing precise compass headings and wind compensation at wave-top altitude would decide everything. A pilot voiced concern about fuel reserves. Mitchell answered truthfully. Full internal tanks plus the drop tanks would provide roughly 10 minutes at maximum power inside the combat zone, sufficient for finding the target, executing the attack, and breaking away. Should unexpected headwinds push fuel consumption higher than anticipated, they might lack sufficient reserves to reach home safely. If the fight extended past 10 minutes, certain pilots risked engine failure before touching down at Guadalcanal. Should anyone's drop tank mechanism jam and quit feeding fuel correctly, that pilot faced an immediate decision: return now or gamble with staying, risking fuel exhaustion over hostile ground. The operation hung by the thinnest thread, demanding flawless performance and a considerable portion of fortune. Another voice posed the question about what happened if they failed. Mitchell's response showed characteristic directness. They'd squander fuel, place 18 aircraft and crews in danger, and Yamamoto would survive, remaining positioned to command Japanese naval forces. Failure represented an unacceptable outcome. Then came the question everyone pondered silently. What chance existed they'd actually locate Yamamoto's Betty somewhere above Bougainville, reaching exactly the correct location and moment after navigating 600 miles with no instruments besides compass and stopwatch? Mitchell paused briefly before answering. He put their probability of success at roughly 1,000 to 1 against them. The gathering turned quiet. Yet they would undertake the mission regardless. These were Admiral Nimitz's direct orders descending ultimately from President Roosevelt himself. Yamamoto had authored the Pearl Harbor scheme, and now America possessed its chance for repayment. Mitchell sent the pilots to gather whatever rest they could manage. Launch would happen at 7:25 the following morning, April 18, 1943. Precisely 12 months after the Doolittle raid struck Tokyo. Some operations stumble upon symbolic significance unintentionally. Operation Vengeance received its timing as deliberate choice. Through that night, maintenance crews completed final checks on all 18 P-38s. Engines roared to life during testing cycles, fuel distribution networks received inspection. The drop tanks got topped with fuel and examined for ruptures. Machine gun ammunition belts loaded into the twin 50 caliber guns and single 20mm cannon housed in each P-38's nose section. Several pilots scratched words into bomb casings or ammunition containers. Others composed letters for loved ones, unable to describe their destination or their objective. Most attempted sleep without success. Hundreds of miles northwest at Rabaul, Admiral Yamamoto made preparations for his inspection tour. Members of his staff urged postponement. American fighter operations had intensified recently. Intelligence indicated that long-range P-38 fighters had appeared at distances further from Guadalcanal than previously supposed feasible. A rigid travel plan with a fixed schedule posed genuine danger, yet Yamamoto rejected changing anything. Morale among Japanese troops scattered throughout the Solomon Islands had deteriorated following months of setbacks. Personnel required visual confirmation that their commander existed, that leadership acknowledged their sacrifices. Postponing would communicate doubt and weakness. The tour would continue exactly as originally planned. Yamamoto changed into the khaki field uniform of the Japanese army instead of his customary naval whites. The choice seemed peculiar, yet practical reasoning guided it. Most bases he would visit served primarily army purposes, and wearing army colors would make the soldiers feel welcomed. He assembled his documents, exchanged farewells with staff members remaining at Rabaul, and proceeded toward the runway. 2 G4M Betty transports sat warming their engines. Yamamoto and his personal attendant, plus the medical officer assigned to the fleet, would travel aboard the lead plane. Vice Admiral Matome Ugaki, Yamamoto's chief of staff, would fly in the trailing Betty alongside additional officers. The two admirals customarily flew together during such journeys, but at the final moment, Yamamoto directed Ugaki toward the second aircraft. The sudden choice would ultimately preserve Ugaki's existence, though he wouldn't recognize that reality for several additional hours. Around 0600 in Tokyo time, equivalent to roughly 0800 local time at Rabaul, the twin Betty bombers lifted off from the runway. 60 fighters from the 204th Air Group arranged themselves as escort, dividing into two V-shaped formations of 3 planes each. They climbed to 6,500 feet, an elevation offering excellent visibility and fuel conservation. The formation pointed southeast in the direction of Bougainville, maintaining steady progress at 180 miles hourly. Approximately 1 hour would see them reach their destination. Yamamoto occupied his seat, studying papers for conferences scheduled at Balale and Buin. Nothing suggested any cause for concern. The transmission detailing his route had employed naval encryption that Japanese cryptographic personnel assured him was utterly secure. Americans couldn't conceivably possess knowledge of his location. Back at Henderson Field on Guadalcanal, pilots consumed breakfast with limited enthusiasm, few possessing actual appetite. By 7:10, they made their way toward the aircraft parked in rows. The 18 P-38 Lightnings each carried 3,000 pounds of fuel distributed through internal containers and external tanks. The excessive weight would present challenges during acceleration and takeoff. Henderson's runway comprised dirt surfacing, stretching roughly 2,000 feet, barely adequate for taking off with overloaded fighters. Rear Admiral Halsey positioned himself at the runway's terminus, personally observing the departure of each fighter. He grasped the stakes and comprehended what danger lay ahead. At 7:25 on April 18, 1943, Mitchell pushed his throttles forward and released the brake pedal. His P-38 began rolling down the runway, moving sluggishly under the burden of supplementary fuel. Dust swirled beneath him. He became airborne with approximately 50 feet of pavement remaining, ascending gradually into the sky. Behind him, 17 additional fighters climbed away at 30-second intervals. Above the waters east of Guadalcanal, the formation assembled, fighters closing together into combat spacing. Then one aircraft reported mechanical trouble. First Lieutenant Joseph Moore announced his drop tank fuel selector mechanism had jammed. Fuel wasn't transferring to his engines. He possessed no alternative but to withdraw. Moore pivoted his P-38 back toward Henderson Field. His participation concluded before engagement began. A second plane encountered a critical failure right off the runway. First, Lieutenant James McClanahan heard his right landing gear tire rupture as he sped along the strip. Rubber disintegrated from the wheel. McClanahan fought his controls, maintaining straightness and getting sky, but landing with a destroyed tire at Henderson presented unacceptable risk. He followed Moore back, 2 fighters gone, both from the attack group. Mitchell shuffled pilots from the escort formation to fill the gaps beside Lanphier and Barber. Holmes and Hine would now join the attack, leaving Mitchell in command of the remaining protective flight. 16 P-38 Lightnings regrouped and headed southbound, dropping down to 50 feet above the surface. Complete radio silence persisted. Pilots observed each other's planes. They tracked Mitchell out in front, yet couldn't exchange words except through hand motions. They flew so reduced that ocean spray coated their canopies at intervals. Certain pilots reported glimpsing sharks in the transparent tropical water. Others tallied pieces of floating wood drifting below. One pilot later swore he fell asleep momentarily, depending on Mitchell's navigation expertise. The journey proved simultaneously dull, nerve-wracking, and punishing. Canopies transformed into furnaces, baking in tropical radiation. Pilots perched upon parachutes, rubber flotation equipment, and survival packages, creating uncomfortable positions throughout the 2-hour ordeal. Mitchell directed the flight by referencing compass bearing, engine speed readings, and elapsed seconds. He watched the ocean surface with intense focus, reading the subtle patterns that wind carved into the waves. When the breeze pushed from one direction, he compensated by adjusting his course slightly, correcting for the invisible force that could throw him miles off target. There was no room for error in what lay ahead. Even the smallest miscalculation, a single degree of drift maintained over 2 hours, would scatter them across empty ocean, nowhere near where they needed to be. This was a one-shot opportunity with no second chances and no margin for recovery. If they failed to intercept their target, they simply wouldn't have the fuel to hunt or search. They'd be forced to turn back toward home, carrying the weight of failure with them for the rest of their lives. The journey itself traced an elaborate path across hostile skies. From Guadalcanal, the formation curved southwest first, then gradually bent northwest, before finally turning north toward their destination. The route was longer, deliberately so. It kept them away from Japanese-held islands where watchful eyes and radio transmitters could alert enemies to their approach and compromise everything. The twin-engine fighters droned forward, hour after hour, the vast Pacific stretching endlessly below them. Fuel gauges crept steadily downward as the powerful Allison engines consumed the gasoline that special drop tanks made possible. At 9:33 in the morning, after exactly 2 hours and 3 minutes in the air, the coastline of Bougainville Island emerged from the haze ahead. A glance at the watch confirmed it. They'd arrived precisely when they were supposed to, hitting the exact coordinates that had been calculated and planned. The navigation was flawless, absolutely flawless. Mitchell's voice crackled across the radio for the first time since takeoff, breaking the silence that had held since they'd left the runway. His call was brief and urgent, alerting the other pilots to what he'd spotted. Enemy aircraft. Bogies. Everyone's eyes snapped upward. There they were, at 6,500 feet, exactly where the intelligence briefings had predicted. 2 Betty bombers flying in loose formation with 6 Zero fighters providing escort. The bombers were descending toward Balali, less than 15 minutes from landing their important passenger. Yamamoto was exactly on schedule, exactly where the intercepted and decoded message said he would be. Impossible odds had suddenly become reality. The time was 9:34 in the morning, 1 minute ahead of Mitchell's calculated intercept time of 9:35. His navigation had proven accurate to within 60 seconds across a 600-mile flight. It was an extraordinary feat. The P-38s jettisoned their drop tanks. 3,000 pounds of weight released from each aircraft. Aluminum containers tumbled through the air, splashing into the ocean below in trails of white spray. Throttles pushed forward with determination. The powerful Allison engines roared to maximum output. Turbochargers spun up, feeding compressed air into hungry cylinders. The P-38s climbed and accelerated, clawing upward for the altitude and speed advantage they desperately needed. The dedicated fighter-killer flight led by Lanphier and Barber peeled away from the main formation, diving hard toward the Betty bombers. Mitchell led the rest of the fighters upward to 18,000 feet, positioning himself to intercept any Zeros that might scramble from nearby airfields. In the lead Betty, someone's eye caught the distinctive twin booms of the P-38s rising from sea level. That profile was unmistakable, American fighters climbing from the water where American fighters had no business being. The Betty pilot's hands tightened on the yoke, throwing his aircraft into a steep diving turn, racing toward the jungle canopy in search of the protection that dense trees could provide, the only shelter where fighters couldn't effectively follow. The second Betty dove right behind it, both bombers now pushing engines to their limits, descending into the green mass below. The 6 Zero escorts rolled into diving turns, accelerating downward to meet the climbing P-38s head-on. Lanphier saw them coming. In that instant, he made his choice. Rather than continue pursuing the bombers, he pulled into a sharp climbing turn, meeting the Zeros head-on. His guns erupted, tracers cutting violent paths through the sky. The Zeros scattered in confusion, their coordinated attack shattered. Lanphier had sacrificed his attack run on the bombers to save his flight from being slaughtered. That left only Barber in position to intercept the fleeing Betty carrying Yamamoto. Barber pressed ahead with his attack. He was behind and below the lead Betty, which now skimmed barely 50 feet above the jungle, engines screaming at full throttle. Barber closed the gap. The distance compressed to 200 yards, then 100. He was flying a borrowed P-38, formerly piloted by Lieutenant Robert Patty. His finger found the firing button. 4 50-caliber machine guns and a 20mm cannon erupted simultaneously. Tracers converged on the Betty's right engine in a deadly stream. Metal tore away from the engine cowling. The engine exploded into flame, streaming black smoke behind the aircraft. Barber walked his fire across the fuselage toward the left engine. More rounds found their mark. The left engine began trailing white smoke, coolant or fuel vaporizing from ruptured lines. The Betty rolled sharply to the left. Barber's P-38 nearly collided with the doomed bomber, and he hauled back hard on the stick to avoid impact. He glanced back. The Betty was falling from the sky, both engines streaming smoke, nose pointed downward. It plunged into the jungle canopy and vanished in an explosion of torn foliage and orange flame. Barber had no time to process what he'd done. Zeros were everywhere around him. He twisted hard, going defensive, trying to shake two fighters that had latched onto his tail. His P-38 shuddered violently as bullets tore into the fuselage and wings. Metal fragments scattered through the air around him. Warning lights flashed red in the cockpit. Barber fought his crippled aircraft away from the battle, heading south toward Guadalcanal, wondering if the damaged fighter would survive the 400-mile journey home. Behind him, Holmes and Hine finally freed their stuck drop tanks. They spotted the second Betty, carrying Admiral Ugar K, attempting to flee at wave-top altitude off the coastline. Holmes attacked first, pouring fire into the Betty's right engine. It began smoking, but his closing speed carried him past the bomber before he could land the killing strike. Hine followed with a long burst into the aircraft. Then Barber, despite his damaged fighter, circled back for another pass. More hits found their target. The Betty's pilot lost control. The aircraft hit the water at full speed near Moyler Point, disintegrating in an enormous spray of white foam and debris. Ugaki felt water rushing into the fuselage as consciousness faded to black. When awareness returned, he was floating in the ocean, buoyed by his life vest, one of only 3 survivors from the second Betty. Everyone aboard Yamamoto's aircraft was dead. Overhead, Mitchell's top cover was tangled in a swirling dogfight with Zeros scrambling up from nearby airfields. No American P-38s were shot down during this phase, though several took damage. Mitchell saw a column of black smoke rising from the jungle to the west. That had to be the lead Betty, the one carrying Yamamoto. Mission accomplished. Mitchell ordered his formation to disengage and turn for home. Fuel reserves were already critical. They'd been fighting in the combat zone for 11 minutes, 1 minute longer than the plan allowed. Every second burned fuel they might desperately need to reach Henderson Field. The P-38s turned south and climbed to altitude, where thinner air meant better fuel efficiency. Several pilots reported fuel gauges showing numbers that should have been impossible. Barber's damaged aircraft was actively leaking fuel from ruptured tanks, leaving a thin vapor trail across the sky. He did the math in his head and didn't like what the numbers told him. The situation looked grim, but turning back meant capture or death. He kept flying, nursing his engines, watching the fuel gauges creep toward empty. One P-38 never returned home. First Lieutenant Raymond Hine vanished during the engagement, and nobody witnessed what happened. Japanese records show no Zero losses that day, suggesting Hine wasn't shot down in aerial combat. His aircraft was probably damaged, perhaps by debris from the Betty he'd attacked or by ground fire, and he either ditched in the ocean or crashed in the jungle. Search and rescue efforts continued until late May, but his body was never found. He was officially declared dead exactly 1 year and 1 day after the mission. His remains were eventually deemed unrecoverable. The remaining 15 P-38s pushed south across open water. Pilots watched fuel gauges with growing dread. Drop tanks ran dry one after another and were discarded. Then the internal tanks began running low. Several pilots calculated they wouldn't make it to Guadalcanal. They tightened their formation, figuring that if ditching became necessary, they'd go down together where they could help each other survive in the water. Search and rescue would have an easier time finding a group of pilots than scattered individuals spread across hundreds of square miles. But they made it. One by one, P-38s touched down at Henderson Field with fuel tanks nearly bone dry. Barber's aircraft was so badly damaged that mechanics counted exactly 104 bullet holes through the fuselage and wings alone. The underside bore a prominent dent from debris impact. and the intercooler was damaged beyond immediate repair. That he'd flown 400 miles in that condition bordered on miraculous. Ground crews and intelligence officers gathered the pilots immediately for debriefing. Mitchell reported the column of smoke rising from the jungle to the west. Barber reported shooting down a Betty in that exact location. Lanfear reported engaging Zeros and possibly hitting a Betty, though he couldn't be certain. The fog of combat made precise accounting nearly impossible, but everyone agreed on one thing. At least one Betty had been destroyed, probably both. The question burning in everyone's mind was simple but urgent. Had Yamamoto been aboard one of those aircraft? The answer would have to wait. Japanese recovery teams would need to reach the crash sites, deep in rugged jungle, accessible only on foot. That would take time. Mitchell's mission had to remain classified. If the Japanese discovered their codes were compromised, they'd overhaul their entire cipher system, and America would lose its intelligence advantage. Halsey and Mitchell began planning additional long-range P-38 missions to other targets throughout the Solomon Islands immediately. These operations would create an impression that American fighters now regularly penetrated deep into Japanese-held airspace. The Yamamoto strike would appear to be one lucky success among many routine operations, rather than a precisely planned action made possible by broken codes. Japanese recovery teams reached Yamamoto's crash site on April 19th, the day after the interception. The Betty's wreckage lay scattered across a jungle hillside in dense vegetation. They found Yamamoto's body still strapped in his seat, which had been thrown clear during the impact. His white-gloved hand still gripped his katana. 2 bullet wounds had been fatal. 1 round had entered his left jaw and exited through his right eye. Another had struck his left shoulder. The wounds told a story consistent with being attacked from behind and below, exactly what Barber had described. The forensic evidence supported Barber's account that he'd shot down the Betty carrying the Admiral. Japanese medical officers performed an autopsy, confirming that both wounds came from .50 caliber bullets, matching P-38 armament. The head wound had killed Yamamoto instantly. He died in his seat at the moment of impact, never knowing what had struck him. His body showed no injuries from the crash itself, confirming he was already dead when the Betty slammed into the jungle. Japan kept Yamamoto's death secret initially. The official announcement didn't come until May 21st, more than a month after the shootdown. When the news finally became public, the Japanese people were devastated. Yamamoto was a national hero, the strategic mind behind early victories, the naval genius who'd orchestrated the attack on Pearl Harbor. His death was announced as occurring during combat operations, with no mention of how or why. The truth, that he'd been ambushed because of compromised codes, remained hidden. Japanese military leaders grew suspicious about their communication security, but they never definitively determined the JN-25 code had been broken. In America, Operation Vengeance remained highly classified. The pilots were ordered not to discuss the mission publicly, but keeping secrets proved impossible. In late May, Time magazine published an article hinting at the mission without full details. Then in October, Time ran a detailed account of the interception, naming Captain Thomas Lanfear as the pilot who'd shot down Yamamoto. Navy intelligence officers were furious at the damage done to code-breaking security. An investigation was launched to identify who'd leaked classified information. The source was never conclusively determined, though Lanfear himself fell under suspicion. The publicity had consequences. Major John Mitchell had been nominated for the Medal of Honor for his extraordinary navigation and leadership during the mission. After the Time magazine article compromised operational security, his nomination was downgraded to the Navy Cross. Still an exceptional honor, but not the nation's highest award. All pilots who flew the mission eventually received Navy Crosses for their courage. But Mitchell's navigation, which made the entire operation possible, deserved the Medal of Honor. The leak cost him that recognition. The controversy over who actually shot down Yamamoto persisted for decades. Lanfear claimed credit, describing how he'd engaged the Zeros and then dove to attack Yamamoto's Betty from above. His version made for compelling storytelling. After the war, he pursued political office and frequently recounted his version in speeches and public appearances. Barber insisted Lanphier had never been positioned to attack Yamamoto's aircraft, that he alone had pursued the lead Betty into the jungle and destroyed it. Other pilots who'd witnessed the engagement backed Barber's account. The confusion partly stemmed from two Bettys being shot down, and the Americans initially not knowing which carried Yamamoto. Years later, Japanese survivors provided testimony that settled the matter. Wreckage evidence, Yamamoto's autopsy report, and accounts from Zero pilots all supported Barber. He'd attacked from behind and below, exactly as the forensic evidence indicated. The bullets had entered from the rear and traveled forward through Yamamoto's body. This trajectory matched a stern attack from a pursuing aircraft, which aligned with Barber's description. Lanphier had fought the Zeros and sacrificed his attack run to protect his flight. Both pilots had performed courageously, but historical evidence conclusively shows Rex Barber fired the rounds that killed Admiral Yamamoto. In 1991, an official Air Force review attempted to settle the controversy by crediting both men with half a kill each. This bureaucratic compromise satisfied neither man and ignored the clear evidence supporting Barber. Full recognition came too late for Barber, who died in 2003, still fighting for proper credit. Lanphier had passed in 1987, maintaining his claim until the end. Yamamoto's death profoundly altered Japanese naval operations for the remainder of the war. Admiral Minichi Koga replaced him as Commander-in-Chief of the Combined Fleet, a competent but uninspired officer who lacked Yamamoto's strategic vision and aggressive instincts. Japanese naval operations after April 1943 became increasingly defensive and passive. The Pacific War's strategic momentum had permanently shifted to the United States. Japan would win no more major naval battles. The long retreat toward home islands had begun. Operation Vengeance's larger strategic impact extended beyond Yamamoto's death. American codebreakers had proven Japanese naval communications were vulnerable, though Japan never fully accepted this reality. Japanese reluctance to completely overhaul their cipher systems gave American intelligence continued access to operational planning throughout the war. The ability to read Japanese naval messages gave American commanders crucial advantages that shortened the conflict and saved American lives. Yamamoto's death mattered tremendously, but preserving America's ability to break Japanese codes arguably proved even more valuable to winning the war. Japan held a state funeral for Yamamoto on June 5, 1943, deliberately scheduled on the 9th anniversary of Admiral Togo's burial, connecting one of Japan's greatest military figures to its most legendary naval hero. The honors that followed reflected his status. He received posthumous promotion to Marshal Admiral, the highest rank the Imperial Japanese Navy could bestow, along with the prestigious Order of the Chrysanthemum. Nazi Germany recognized him too, awarding him the Knight's Cross of the Iron Cross with oak leaves and swords, one of their most distinguished military decorations. His remains were divided respectfully. Part of him was laid to rest in Tokyo beside Admiral Togo at Tsukiji Hongan-ji Temple, while the rest returned to his family's burial grounds in Nagaoka City. The technological story behind Operation Vengeance deserves just as much attention as the code-breaking and brilliant flying. Drop tanks made this mission possible. Without them, the fighters would never have reached Bougainville. Ben Kelsey's decision to defy the bomber mafia back in November 1941 created exactly the capability that would prove decisive 2 years later. The chain of events was straightforward. Kelsey authorized the modifications. Lockheed engineers built them. The P-38 sitting at Henderson Field had the hardpoints and fuel systems ready to go. When Admiral Mitchell needed fighters capable of flying 1,000 miles, the P-38s could be reconfigured for that exact mission. If Kelsey hadn't pushed ahead with his vision, Yamamoto would have completed his inspection tour and returned safely home. The drop tank story didn't end that day in April 1943. Throughout 1943 and 1944, American fighters equipped with external fuel tanks pushed their range deeper and deeper into enemy territory. P-38s with drop tanks escorted bombers into the heart of Germany itself, protecting them from Luftwaffe fighters and cutting bomber losses dramatically. In the Pacific, P-38s with drop tanks flew missions stretching beyond 1,000 miles, reaching Japanese bases that had previously seemed unreachable. The P-51 Mustang with drop tanks could escort bombers from England all the way to Berlin and back. Even the powerful P-47 Thunderbolt became a devastating long-range fighter bomber once equipped with external tanks. By 1944, even the most stubborn bomber advocates had to face reality. Drop tanks were essential tools that multiplied the effectiveness of both fighters and bombers. The official policy that had forbidden their development quietly vanished. Nobody ever apologized for the earlier ban. Nobody acknowledged that Kelsey had been right all along and the bomber mafia had been dead wrong. But the policy changed, and American fighters continued extending their range as drop tank technology improved. The numbers told the story. Before fighter escorts became routine in Europe, bomber crews faced brutal odds, roughly 25 to 30 missions before they'd statistically be shot down, killed, or captured. Once continuous fighter escort using drop tank-equipped fighters became standard, everything changed. A bomber crew that completed a full tour of 25 missions shifted from miraculous to probable. The difference? Thousands of lives saved. Charles Lindbergh contributed to extending the P-38's range, but not until mid-1944, over a year after Operation Vengeance. Denied military service because of his pre-war opposition to American involvement, Lindbergh worked as a civilian technical consultant for United Aircraft. He departed for the Pacific on April 24, 1944, and flew his first combat mission on May 21. Between May and September 1944, he flew approximately 50 missions and demonstrated fuel conservation techniques that dramatically extended the Lightning's range. He taught pilots to reduce engine RPM to 1,600, lean out the carburetor to auto-lean, and cruise at reduced airspeeds. These simple adjustments cut fuel consumption from 90 gallons per hour down to 70 gallons per hour, extending range by hundreds of miles, sometimes as much as 400 miles. P-38 pilots who thought 6 to 8 hour missions represented the maximum discovered they could stay airborne for 10 hours, using Lindbergh's methods. But these techniques arrived too late to affect Operation Vengeance. The mission succeeded using standard fuel management procedures, relying entirely on the extra capacity the drop tanks provided. Kelsey's modifications made the mission possible. Mitchell's brilliant navigation brought the fighters to the interception point at precisely the right moment. Barber's accurate gunnery destroyed Yamamoto's Betty, and the P-38 Lightning, equipped with technology that violated official doctrine, proved itself the only American fighter capable of flying this mission. The P-38 Lightning became one of the war's most successful American fighters in the Pacific theater. During the war, P-38s destroyed more than 1,800 Japanese aircraft. Over 100 P-38 pilots became aces, pilots who'd achieved 5 or more confirmed kills. The two highest-scoring American aces of World War II both flew Lightnings. Major Richard Bong earned 40 victories, while Major Thomas Maguire recorded 38 victories, all in P-38s. The Lightning's long range, reliability, and heavy firepower made it perfectly suited for the vast distances and harsh conditions of Pacific operations. Total P-38 production reached between 10,037 and 10,038 aircraft, depending on how the factories counted prototypes and test aircraft. The P-38 served in every theater of World War II, but achieved its greatest success in the Pacific and Mediterranean. In Europe, the P-51 Mustang gradually replaced it because the Mustang had superior high-altitude performance. But in the Pacific, where long range over water and twin-engine reliability mattered most, the P-38 remained a frontline fighter until the war ended. Yet the P-38's most famous moment remained Operation Vengeance. Yamamoto's shoot-down demonstrated that even the most careful operational security could be compromised by superior intelligence. It showed that long-range fighters could execute precision missions beyond what military planners thought possible. And it proved that technological innovation, even when it defied official policy, could produce strategic consequences that changed the course of wars. The people who made Operation Vengeance possible came from remarkably different backgrounds. Benjamin Kelsey was an engineer and test pilot who understood that rules sometimes needed bending for the greater good. John Mitchell was a fighter pilot from Mississippi who could navigate 600 miles across open ocean using only a compass and watch. Rex Barber was a young lieutenant who kept his nerve during aerial combat chaos and delivered accurate fire under crushing pressure. Admiral Mark Mitchell was a staff officer who recognized an intelligence opportunity and acted decisively to seize it. Chester Nimitz was a fleet commander who understood that killing Yamamoto was worth risking America's greatest intelligence advantage. And the Navy crypt analysts, including Hamright, Tommy Dyer, and Alva Laswell, plus traffic analyst John Paul Stevens, provided the intelligence that made the entire mission possible. Not one of these men could have succeeded alone. Crypt analysts provided the intelligence, but without fighters that could reach Bougainville, that intelligence meant nothing. Mitchell's navigation brought the fighters to the right place, but without drop tanks, they'd never have attempted the flight. Barber's gunnery killed Yamamoto, but without decoded messages revealing his schedule, Yamamoto would never have been vulnerable to ambush. The operation succeeded because each element formed an essential link in an unbreakable chain. After the war, the Americans who planned and executed Operation Vengeance scattered to different lives. For many years, they couldn't discuss the mission because it remained classified. John Mitchell retired from the Air Force as a colonel and lived until 1995. Rex Barber became a civil engineer and spent decades fighting for recognition that he'd shot down Yamamoto's Betty. He died in 2003. Thomas Lanphier pursued a political career and continued claiming credit for killing Yamamoto until his death in 1987. Admiral Mark Mitchell continued commanding carrier forces throughout the Pacific War, earning a reputation as one of the Navy's most aggressive and effective leaders. His health broke under years of combat operations. He died in 1947. Admiral William Halsey became one of America's most famous naval officers, dying in 1959. Chester Nimitz retired as Fleet Admiral and lived until 1966, watching naval power transform with nuclear-powered submarines and aircraft carriers. Admiral Matome Ugaki, who survived the crash of the second Betty bomber, continued serving in the Japanese Navy. On August 15, 1945, hours after Japan announced its surrender, Ugaki led a final kamikaze mission against Allied ships near Okinawa. His aircraft was shot down. He chose death over the shame of surrender, following the samurai code that had shaped his entire life. Benjamin Kelsey received remarkably little public recognition during his lifetime. His role in developing drop tanks for the P-38 remained classified for decades after the war. He was promoted to Brigadier General on September 5, 1952, and retired on December 31, 1955. He worked in the aerospace industry and consulted on fighter development programs, but never sought public credit for enabling Operation Vengeance. Kelsey died on March 3, 1981, at age 74, having lived long enough to see American fighters evolve from the piston-engine P-38s he helped develop to supersonic jets like the F-15 Eagle. He never flew in combat despite his extensive test pilot experience, because military leadership considered his engineering expertise too valuable to risk in combat zones. Yet his contributions to American air power extended far beyond Operation Vengeance. He was instrumental in developing the P-51 Mustang, arguably the finest fighter aircraft of World War II. He pushed hard for developing the P-80 Shooting Star, America's first operational jet fighter. The lesson of Operation Vengeance extends far beyond killing one admiral. Military organizations must balance the need for standardized doctrine against the reality that doctrine becomes obsolete as technology evolves. Regulations serve important purposes. They provide structure, consistency, and predictability. But regulations that prevent innovation can be as dangerous as having no regulations at all. Kelsey understood this tension. He knew the bomber mafia's prohibition on drop tanks was fundamentally wrong. He knew fighters would desperately need long range in the coming war. He could have simply followed orders and protected his career. Instead, he authorized modifications without written authorization and accepted full personal responsibility if his gamble failed. That decision created the capability that killed Yamamoto and saved thousands of lives in the years that followed. The ironies pile up relentlessly. Yamamoto opposed war with America precisely because he understood American industrial capacity would overwhelm Japan in any prolonged conflict. He was killed by American technology that demonstrated exactly the kind of innovation he feared most. He died because Japanese cipher systems weren't as secure as Japanese cryptographers believed. And he died precisely on schedule because his legendary punctuality made him vulnerable to ambush. The Americans who planned and executed Operation Vengeance risked their code-breaking capabilities, their single most valuable intelligence asset, for the chance to kill one man. That gamble could have backfired catastrophically if Japan had recognized their codes were compromised. Japan never made that connection, but the risk was absolutely real. Whether the gamble was worth it remains genuinely debatable. Yamamoto's replacement was less capable, but Japan's strategic situation in April 1943 was already desperate. Perhaps the greatest irony is that Yamamoto's death had more symbolic than strategic impact. Japanese morale suffered when their greatest naval hero was killed. American morale received a powerful boost from revenge for Pearl Harbor, but the Pacific War's outcome was determined by industrial production, not individual leaders. America was building aircraft carriers faster than Japan could sink them. American factories were producing aircraft at rates Japan could never match. The mathematics were inexorable and impossible to escape. Yamamoto understood this reality better than most Japanese leaders. His death removed a voice of realism from Japanese strategic planning, but it didn't change the fundamental math of the war. External fuel tanks remain absolutely essential for military aircraft 80 years later. Modern fighter aircraft carry sophisticated composite tanks that can withstand higher speeds and G-forces than the aluminum tanks Lockheed designed for the P-38. The F-15 Eagle typically carries 3 external tanks holding approximately 1,350 gallons total. The F-16 Fighting Falcon routinely flies with 2 or 3 external tanks depending on mission requirements. The F/A-18 Super Hornet extends its range using external tanks for strike missions hundreds of miles from the carrier. Every modern fighter depends on drop tanks for extended range operations. Even stealth aircraft make compromises to accommodate external tanks. The F-35 Lightning II can carry external tanks when operating in permissive environments where stealth matters less than range. This flexibility allows the aircraft to execute long-range strike missions when needed, accepting temporarily reduced stealth for increased operational radius. A modern composite drop tank costs approximately $20,000 to $50,000. An aerial refueling sortie costs hundreds of thousands of dollars. For missions within drop tank range, external tanks are far more economical than tanker support. This economic advantage ensures drop tanks will remain relevant even as aerial refueling becomes more sophisticated. The story of Operation Vengeance is ultimately about the crucial importance of innovation in military effectiveness. Benjamin Kelsey saw what needed doing and had the courage to do it despite fierce bureaucratic opposition. Oliver Eccles provided the institutional protection that allowed innovation to proceed. Lockheed engineers designed and built the technology. Navy cryptanalysts provided the intelligence. Admiral Mitchell recognized the opportunity. John Mitchell navigated perfectly. Rex Barber executed with skill and composure. Each contribution was absolutely essential. Each required different talents and occupied different roles. The mission succeeded because all these elements aligned at exactly the right moment. Remove any single element and the mission fails completely. This is the fundamental lesson for anyone interested in how organizations achieve difficult objectives. Innovation requires people willing to challenge established doctrine when it's wrong. Kelsey could have followed orders and avoided risk. He chose to defy the bomber mafia because he understood their doctrine would cost lives. His willingness to take that risk created capabilities that saved thousands of lives. Innovation requires organizational structures that protect innovators from bureaucratic retaliation. Eccles could have enforced the prohibition. He chose to protect Kelsey and allow the work to proceed. Without this protection, Kelsey's initiative would have been crushed. Innovation requires skilled engineers who can turn concepts into actual hardware. Lockheed engineers designed effective drop tanks in weeks. Factory workers built them in months. Excellence in execution proved as important as brilliance in conception. Innovation requires operational commanders willing to use new capabilities creatively. Mitchell could have declined the mission as too risky. He could have argued that 1,000-mile fighter missions were impossible. Instead, they accepted the challenge and executed flawlessly. Technology creates possibilities, but people must choose to exploit those possibilities. Benjamin Kelsey died in 1981 with relatively little public recognition. His obituary noted his contributions to fighter development, but didn't emphasize how his defiance created capabilities that proved decisive. The general public, to the extent it knows about Operation Vengeance, remembers the pilots who flew the mission. Few know the engineer who made it possible. This obscurity reflects broader patterns in how military history is remembered. Combat soldiers become heroes. Pilots who shoot down enemies become aces. Engineers who design equipment remain largely invisible. Their contributions are less dramatic and harder to quantify, but without them, military forces cannot function effectively. Operation Vengeance succeeded because of accumulated contributions at every level. Engineers developed technology. Cryptanalysts provided intelligence. Planners coordinated logistics. Pilots executed the mission. Each element was necessary but not sufficient. Success required all of them working together. 80 years later, military forces still depend on people like Benjamin Kelsey. They need officers who understand technology well enough to recognize when regulations prevent necessary innovation. They need engineers who can turn concepts into hardware quickly. They need commanders who can exploit new capabilities creatively. And they need institutional structures flexible enough to accommodate innovation while maintaining essential discipline, finding that balance is delicate and never perfect. Organizations that allow too much deviation lose coherence. Organizations that enforce doctrine too rigidly become obsolete. Finding equilibrium is one of the fundamental challenges of military leadership. Kelsey and Eccles found that balance in 1941. Their judgment was vindicated in 1943 when P-38 Lightnings, equipped with forbidden drop tanks, flew 1,000 miles to kill Admiral Yamamoto. That mission stands as powerful testament to the transformative power of innovation and the courage of individuals who defy wrong-headed policies when lives depend on getting things right. The forbidden fuel tanks that made Operation Vengeance possible represent something much larger than one successful mission. They represent the principle that innovation should not be strangled by bureaucratic resistance to change. They represent the importance of individuals who understand technology and possess the courage to take risks to provide capabilities that will be desperately needed. They represent the reality that wars are won not just by soldiers who fight, but by engineers who provide the tools that make victory possible. In the end, this is the story of how one engineer's unauthorized decision in November 1941 changed the course of the Pacific War. Kelsey authorized modifications that violated official policy. 16 months later, those modifications enabled 18 P-38 Lightnings to fly 1,000 miles and kill the architect of Pearl Harbor. The chain of causation ran from quiet bureaucratic defiance to dramatic combat success, illustrating how military effectiveness is truly built, not through battlefield heroics alone, but through the accumulated contributions of people at every level who see what needs doing and find ways to do it. Operation Vengeance proves that sometimes the most important battles are fought not with guns and bombs, but with innovation and the courage to challenge orthodoxy when lives depend on getting it right.